Minister, Mr. William Waldegrave, has said that the government of President Ceausescu of Romania should be overthrown. Anything we can do from outside to speed its collapse, it is right to do, he said. As more details emerge of what appears to have been a massacre of demonstrators in the western city of Timișoara at the weekend, Mr. Waldegrave said the days of this ruthless regime are numbered. Those killed in the city of Timișoara are now thought to run into the hundreds, some sources say as many as 300 to 400. Reports from Hungary talk of more protests in the towns of Arad and Brasov.
Tonight, Romania stands like an impregnable fortress, with all of its 4 borders closed. No traffic, not even transit traffic, is being allowed through. Earlier today, tourists were allowed to leave. Some had come from Timișoara. This Austrian tourist described the aftermath of the massacre. He said today it stood deserted, cleared up, like after China's Tiananmen. The closed borders make news patchy. Tonight in Budapest, Hungary's capital, there were reports of 400 dead, and also that there were more plans for demonstrations in Romania. But some of Budapest's inhabitants have their own eyewitness accounts of Timișoara. This man was there, on a mission to help persecuted Christian friends, smuggling Bibles through the border in soap packets. He fled when the police charged, terrified for his life, but he said the students were peaceful and determined.
Students shouted, Jos Ceausescu, down Ceausescu, and away with dictatura.
He said then there were many policemen. They charged at the crowds. He panicked with his friends and fled. He feels certain many were killed in the gunfire. Tonight in Budapest, Romanian refugees prayed for family and friends unable to leave as they had done before the weekend shooting. It's now looking increasingly unlikely that any more Romanians will be able to flee across the border to safety in Budapest. The trains are all being searched, the planes have been stopped, and even the river traffic on the Danube has been halted. This Romanian exile, desperate for news of his girlfriend in Timișoara, has caught 3 trains to Romania. 3 times he's been turned back at the border. Tonight he left again, certain he'd fail in his mission to get there, but totally helpless. One man on a train, with the full weight of Romania's police state between him and his girlfriend. Penny Marshall, News at 10, Budapest.
There was a time 11 years ago when Nicolae Ceausescu was the Queen's honoured guest. Today, Her Majesty's government used the strongest language it could to express its sense of outrage at what's happened in Romania. The Romanian ambassador was called into the Foreign Office to be told that Britain, quote, condemned in the strongest possible terms the violent suppression of a peaceful demonstration. And the Foreign Office Minister, William Waldegrave, said Britain had the right to do what it could to hasten the downfall of the Ceausescu regime.
I just have the feeling that this sandcastle will be swept away by the tide in due course, and it's simply a matter of how many Romanians have to suffer before the Ceausescus, the whole family, recognize the inevitability of what is happening across Eastern Europe.
In Brussels, the Soviet foreign minister referred to the unpleasant things that had happened in Romania.
If indeed a tragedy has happened and people have died, I can only express my very, very profound regret over that. As for my overall fundamental approach, the base fundamental approach of the Soviet leadership, we are categorically opposed to the use of force.
Later, Mr. Shevardnadze flew to London for talks first with the Foreign Secretary and then with Mrs. Thatcher. In their public statements, neither referred directly to Romania, but government sources said later that while discussing Eastern Europe, both of them had expressed their concern about what was going on there. Michael Brunson, News at 10, Westminster.
Romanian exiles around the world have been trying to contact friends and relatives to find out what's happening in their home country. In London, a Romanian newspaper rushed out a special edition condemning the crackdown. And in Geneva, the exiled King Michael of Romania has said the only hope for his country is political pressure from the rest of the world.
Down with the dictatorship of the Ceausescu's clan, down with the communism, long live the fight of the Romanian people for freedom.
At the offices of the Free Romanian newspaper, this month's edition had just gone to press, but there was still time to print thousands of inserts denouncing the killings. there was little more the staff could do. Throughout the day, trying unsuccessfully to update news reports from Timișoara and Bucharest. Leading Romanian intellectuals had had all day to weigh up the implications of the events at Timișoara. Democracy, they said, had never seemed further away.
I cannot see it happening without violence, without bloodshed, particularly because of what happened on Sunday. People are storing up anger and resentment to such a degree, and I think what happened on Sunday added so much to it that any change will be a violent change.
But can you rely on the army?
Well, that is debatable, of course. I would hope not. On the other hand, as we have seen only a little while ago, in China the army has been instrumental in quashing the demonstrations in Tiananmen Square.
It is our turn, the Romanians' turn, to bleed for freedom. The Poles had their turn in 1980-81, so did the Czechs in 68, the Hungarians earlier. The time has come for the Romanians, and unfortunately, there is no other way. I don't think that there is any other way.
In Switzerland tonight, a small group of anti-Ceausescu protesters sang the Romanian national anthem in remembrance of those killed in their homeland. Few would recognize this face in the crowd, a deposed queen, Anne of Romania, whose husband was forced to abdicate the throne 40 years ago. It demonstrated the readiness of exiled King Michael to highlight the violent excesses of the Romanian regime. Deposed at the age of 19, he maintains very close links with the British royal family, as this year's Christmas cards at his home outside Geneva point out. The House of Windsor, from the Queen downwards, clearly sympathetic to the King's circumstances, and doubtless to a new wave of threatening telephone calls and letters he's received in recent days. Some are taken seriously. The source of them, he believes, from Romanian secret police. Tonight, with his daughter, Princess Margherita, he crossed into France to speak freely and condemn the Romanian reprisals as a revolting way to repress the people.
It's a degrading way of behaving when people are manifesting their wish for freedom and democracy, and all that is put down in blood. It's awful. I see what's going on. I take part to the suffering of the people. I try to open these people's minds abroad, but there's not much response up to now.
He believes that international opinion must now change and warns that a greater challenge to Romania's dictatorship will come from within, perhaps with even greater loss of life. Brent Sadler, News at 10, Geneva.
And some news just in. The Yugoslav news agency has just claimed that up to 2,000 people have been killed in Romania since the weekend. We'll have more details later. Sandy.
Here, the government is to pay £150 million in compensation to investors who lost money when the Barlow-Klaus empire collapsed 18 months ago. The announcement by the Trade Secretary, Mr. Nicholas Ridley, followed severe criticism of his department in a report on the affair. The parliamentary ombudsman said the Department of Trade and Industry had been guilty of significant maladministration.
Gibraltar was at the centre of the colourful and highly controversial Barlow-Klaus affair. Many investors, some of them pensioners, put their money into Barlow-Klaus' Gibraltar-based fund. They thought their nest egg was in secure government stocks, but their money was spent in a number of ways, some allegedly on this luxury yacht. Only a small proportion may be traced. Most of the British investors lost their life savings. The co-founder of Barlow-Klaus, Peter Klaus, has been charged jointly with 3 others of stealing more than £22 million. He's currently on bail. Last year, the then Trade Secretary, Lord Young, after his own inquiry, refused to compensate investors. But today, after the parliamentary ombudsman found his department guilty of maladministration, Nicholas Ridley gave way.
The government has decided, in the exceptional circumstances of this case, and out of respect for the office of the Parliamentary Commissioner, to make substantial ex gratia payments to all investors who have suffered loss.
Mr. Ridley didn't accept the Ombudsman's criticisms. That angered the opposition.
Will he now tell us who in the government intends to take responsibility for this negligence on a vast scale that is now costing vast sums of public money?
Despite repeated warnings, the DTI awarded this licence to Barlow-Klaus and allowed the public to continue investing. In December 1984, the Bank of England told the DTI of its serious concerns about Barlow Clowes. In March 1985, a DTI official noted there was a serious danger that if the matter's allowed to drag on, the department will be held to be negligent if it turns out something's wrong. In August 1986, a Barlow Clowes director, expressing concern about the company, talked of possible fraud, nature unknown. In July 1987, Greater Manchester Police told the DTI they'd been asked to check on Barlow Clowes and reports of money being shipped abroad, but that no immediate action was being taken. In September 1987, the Deputy Governor of the Bank of England wrote to the DTI saying, "We find all this rather worrying. Just as in 1985, our concern remains that the size of the Barlow Clowes operation could lead to a major city scandal." 8 months later, the firm was wound up. The investors who would never have put money into Barlow Clowes if they'd known of these official warnings have now found some satisfaction.
Retired Army Major Leslie Mullard, who led the investors' fight and insisted the Ombudsman was called in, waited anxiously at his Cheshire home for news from the House of Commons. He was forced to sell his showpiece home of 25 years after his life savings of £65,000 disappeared with Barlow Clowes UK and Gibraltar funds. Although he'll receive over 80% compensation, he's not entirely happy.
Who can compensate for the trauma, the anxiety, the stress that my wife and I have experienced over the last 18 months, coupled together with the forced sale of the home we so much loved?
So there's no cause for celebration tonight?
Romania's revolution of the people is a story of extraordinary fortitude in the face of great bloodshed, with the classic elements of the dismantling of tyranny. It is a story, too, of the horror of Timișoara's massacres with which Ceausescu sought to stall it all, of unmarked graves, and of firefights rending the night sky. The inferno that was communist dictatorship in Romania, the coming together of the army and the people to overwhelm the tyranny. And yet, nothing that had happened elsewhere in Europe in 1989 had ever warned that in Romania it would prove to be so terrifyingly different. For when Solidarity swept Poland's elections in June, the communists accepted their time was up, allowing Mazowiecki triumphantly into power as the Warsaw Pact's first non-communist premier. Hungary's communists, seeing that Soviet tanks would not roll again, allowed Budapest's spires to ring to the dawning of new democracy. East Germany's Honecker wanted to resist, but his people overwhelmed him, and even the hated wall broke open without a shot fired. Czechoslovakia's communists had seen Soviet tanks repress freedom before. Deprived of Moscow's support, now they too surrendered peacefully to the people's will. Even Bulgaria's communist dictator Todor Zhivkov went almost unnoticed, bowing to the people's call after more than 30 years of tyranny. Within just 5 months, the political map of Eastern Europe had been transformed, sweeping out communist regimes country after country with no shot fired. But Romania's Ceausescu ensured that in his country alone it would be terrifyingly different. When he addressed Romanians last Thursday, he did so from a position bolstered by a system built upon favoritism, fear, plain-clothed gunmen and informers. The Ceausescu dictatorship had translated a rich agricultural society into poverty. Whole communities were bulldozed to make way for schemes to flatter his own ego. The people were rewarded with food shortages, power cuts, and the forcible demolition of their homes. In Bucharest's main square on Thursday, there were his extended family and the party apparatchiks in the front row applauding. But even their applause was not enough to drown the freedom infection from Eastern Europe. He could no longer suppress it. And suddenly he knew it. That, to the sound of martial music, was the last the world saw of Ceausescu as president. That night, civil war came to Bucharest. Ceausescu's plainclothed gunmen, the secret police, launched a desperate battle for survival. The army, joining with the people, fought to flush them out. By dawn, the people were chanting, "Ceausescu is no more." This was revolution without fear. Flags with the symbols of communist dictatorship ripped from their hearts. Tanks moving like human mountains. The killings in Timișoara had provoked no caution here. By now, the television station was at the epicenter of the revolution. In a country in which a gathering of 6 people had been a crime, here the bedraggled new order announced Ceausescu's fall and appealed for help.
Priviți-mă, nu sunt niciun zmeu, nu sunt niciun Dumnezeu, sunt un român care vreau și sub orice formă vreau alături de noi să vină întreaga, dar absolut întreaga populație. Ieșiți în stradă, români, veniți aici la televiziunea română.
In the studio, the ragged revolutionaries were barely able to contain their feelings as one of Romania's most celebrated dissident poets was introduced. He was to speak as if viewers might hear him without the necessity of camera or microphone.
Nu părăsiți posturile de televiziune, care sunt foarte importante. Diseară, să sperăm că până diseară, apelăm la conducerea armatei. Câțiva reprezentanți de frunte să se prezinte aici, ai armatei și ai Ministerului de Interne, să fie alături de noi. Să vorbească armatei și poporului alături de noi, din fiecare județ. Armata să pună la dispoziția celor din eroicului popor din Timișoara și din toate centrele țării. Vă rog să mă iertați.
An army officer pushed his way forward, determined to provide the material proof that the army had indeed joined with the people.
Niciun militar nu va trage în populație. Nu sunt autorizat de nimeni, pentru că nu mai există conducerea Ministerului Apărării Naționale. Dar vă spun, din sufletul militarilor români, nimeni nu va trage în popor. Dar trebuie să dovediți armata!
Here, live on Ceausescu's prime television channel, the alliance was being forged that in the subsequent 48 hours would be tested to the limits. Outside the television station, the people gathered in response to the appeal for help. Down with Ceausescu, they shouted. The television technicians responded by playing the pre-Ceausescu national anthem. Back in the television studio, students, their eyes beaten black by the secret police, appeared once more to rally the people.
Mulțumim tuturor celor care în clipe decisive pentru viitorul țării noastre au fost alături de întregul popor, cu fapta și cu gândurile celor care s-au jertfit. Pentru măreția acestei clipe le aducem profundul nostru omagiu și veșnică memorie.
And more army officers came to tell the people that those responsible for the massacres in Timișoara and elsewhere would be punished, that the people must not take the law into their own hands. The Patriarch of the Orthodox Church turned up to tell his priests and followers, in a country in which worship had been under siege, help guide the people in this their historic work. So from nothing, from no organization, this ragbag clutch of writers, intellectuals and artists, suddenly a new political grouping developed live on air in the television studio. But as their one-way dialogue with the people continued, words suddenly appeared on the screen. The water is poisoned in Timișoara and Sibiu, it declared, the work of the secret police. Suddenly, a man declares from a note that Ceausescu himself is captured, just 60 miles from the capital. But it is to prove to be the first of many rumors of the dictator's whereabouts. Outside again, classic revolution is by now in full flow. The dictator's books and belongings tossed from balconies. His wife's portraits are disfigured. Pent-up feelings are released. Down with the tyrant, they scrawl. University Square is as never before, yet this is the very arena that in an hour is to become a battleground. There's a bustle at the television station. Nicolae Ceausescu has been found and brought to be paraded, his face already bruised. The scale of killings by his father's hated secret police is such that his very survival here is remarkable. As he's manhandled through the studio complex, startling television workers at their consoles. A prized beneficiary of all that was most evil about his father's dynastic rule. Nicu is the third most loathed functionary of the old order, after first his father and second his mother. Just a week ago, to have had him here beneath the studio lights would have been to have had royalty in their midst. Now a disheveled criminal, he was to be bundled unceremoniously away to stand accused of great crimes against humanity. Amongst the worst lay in the killing fields of the Ceausescu tyranny many miles to the west. Timișoara, a city stunned by the enormity of his departing crimes. ITN's Penny Marshall was amongst the first outsiders to enter the city. Go to our cemetery, they urged her.
Go to our cemetery. The dead people are there.
At their graveyard, more people were gathering. They claimed some of the victims from the shooting had been buried here in a mass unmarked grave. Now they were digging them up. They claimed this was the proof of their massacre. We saw the bodies of 30 young men, and as these, the poorer people of the town, prayed, they alleged thousands more had been burnt to cover up the atrocity.
The great weight of what they had endured hung heavily on the crowd, but as the new leaders of their fledgling revolution rallied them, they began to demonstrate that the Securitate had failed to beat the life out of them. Exhausted students seized the chance to appeal to the outside world.
I want to say to all the world, be with us. Don't let Ceausescu's security kill us. Kill us.
But as they raised their voices in solidarity with the army that was trying to protect them, here too there would be more killing before the night was out. Romania's violent collision of joy and sudden death was never more deftly demonstrated than by the swaying revelers on Friday night. One moment, jangling bells, singing forbidden folk songs, clambering on tanks, waving flags. The next moment, running for their lives. The air split by automatic fire. Once more, the people and the army were pitted against the Securitate secret police, moving from building to building, each previous haven belching flames into the night sky. Yet as suddenly as it had begun, the shooting stopped, and the army invited back onto the streets the people to celebrate. And there they were, riding the tanks once more, until the equally sudden attack by the secret police on the television station. ITN's Paul Davis was one of the first correspondents into Bucharest. Here's how he saw the battle for the revolution's heartland.
Inside the besieged television studios, tension as rumours circulated that the deposed president's agents had already infiltrated the building. All eyes and guns were trained on the lift shafts. The television workers say the secret police have tunnels leading here inside the television station. The reason their guns are pointed at the elevators is that they can't be sure just who will come through those doors next. The battle outside raged for more than 3 hours. It ended suddenly with the arrival of more tanks opposed to the old communist regime. It's now after 5 o'clock in the morning. The shooting has finally finished, and the revolutionaries are still in charge of the television station. The crowd celebrated their victory as ambulances ferried away the casualties, and the army launched a mopping-up operation, pursuing those forces still loyal to Ceausescu, often coming under sniper fire, as they chased an elusive enemy away from the city centre out into the suburbs.
Some of the fiercest fighting that night was out at Bucharest's international airport. The tracer bullets describing yet again the army with the people trying to secure strategic positions against invading secret police, whose bullets ricocheted repeatedly off the military's armour. The Securitate were rash enough to try to bring a busload of reinforcements in. Alex Thompson of ITN's Channel 4 News was in the airport terminal.
Here at Bucharest Airport, a fierce gun battle has now been going on more or less continuously for several hours between the army and forces still loyal to the Ceausescu regime. They've been using tanks, heavy artillery and machine gun. The dead and injured are still being brought into the main terminal building.
Here there was a foretaste of the ultimate victory. The army's heavier firepower had prevailed. Tanks that had turned upon Ceausescu's henchmen maneuvered around their corpses. The dawn light revealing the airport as a battle wasteland, military machinery at angles, and everywhere the dead of civil war. Troops fanning out across the outfield, gathering up their dead. At the runway's end, the secret police that had survived the battle came out and surrendered. Here there were no lynching gangs, no summary revenge. The rules of war respected. The simplicity of neatly served tea for the victors. Those caught in the crossfire savouring survival.
Victory!
But daylight in Bucharest itself looked far from victorious. Smoke and flames were billowing from the capital's key buildings, and the bitterest of civil war was in full cry. And yet, even amid the heaviest of crossfire with so many dead, the bid to save a life went on. The hospitals could by now take no more, but still the wounded came. Quietly at a hospital table, women prepared new dressings. By now, they'd even had to resort to cutting up the bed sheets. There was no time to tend to the dead, even though the coffins were stacking outside in readiness. Half a day on from the morning and still the civil war raged. The army and the people raining bullets onto a secret police hideout. Ordinary people just crouched and waited. Here was an army trained for Warsaw Pact maneuvers, never for close combat with other Romanians. Yet this conscript army fought for brothers and sisters on the streets. They, in turn, dangerously ferried food for their relatives in the army. It was the one weakness in Ceausescu's satanic scheme to divide in order to rule. Suddenly, once more, the tanks became the symbols of revolutionary victory. A small Romanian Fiat doubling as a celebratory tank. Suddenly, a secret policeman was isolated and tried to run the gauntlet of the crowd. But both outside and within the revolutionary confines of the television station itself, kicks and punches were hurled in his direction. Above the burning buildings, the Air Force was in the air. The troops below were growing confident. The damage to this once great European city was profound, and yet the street life still managed to weave a way through the civil war. Back at the television studios once more. This time, for sure, they said, Ceausescu and his wife are captured.
Că Nicolae și Elena Ceaușescu au fost arestați și se află sub pază militară.
He's held by the army, they said. In a lull in the fighting once more, the people filled the city square. The army is with us, they chanted, apparently unafraid that this so often had been the battleground and would again be before the day was out. Their certainty of victory plunged an axe through the image of Ceausescu's forehead. Last night was the same as the first 5 nights of the revolution, except that now, despite pockets of resistance, the revolutionaries smelt victory amid the flames. Still, the army had fought together with the people. A kind of standoff in the air as the information center in the television station sought to sift truth and reality from paranoia and rumor. Weariness, wariness, and fear still stalked the revolution's heartland. Every new arrival was treated with suspicion. This man later ran amok and shot 6 people inside the TV center. The army outside was once more a conventional force in defense of the new order, ironically well trained for it by the old. On the air today, Romania's what the papers say. No need for translation here. The tyrant is behind bars. And from Ceausescu's palace, a trophy, his family album. Nicolae with the dogs the Queen gave him as a gift. Nicolae sustained in other times by the West, feared in the East. Today, his presidential album is forever closed.
The orchestra of
The Romanian Revolution wasn't rational and peaceable like the others in Eastern Europe. The overthrow of Nicolae Ceausescu cost a lot of lives, among them Marin Neagu's. He worked in an abattoir, not a very good husband, fond of drink, often violent. But now he's a martyr. Goaded beyond endurance by a brutal and cruel system, he left his wife behind and joined the big demonstrations. He was hit in the head by a stray bullet. It took his widow a week to find his body.
He was a simple worker, but he wanted revenge in some way. He wanted revenge for the conditions he had to live in. He shouted out loud for his family back at home who couldn't shout. He told me he was going to fight for the children, and if he died, he would die for our children, for the way we lived, without food and rations.
In this supposedly socialist republic, the workers and peasants suffered most. Their electricity was harshly rationed, so was food, 10 eggs per month, and meat so rare it didn't need to be rationed. The Neagus got occasional unappetizing joints from their abattoir. He worked 7 days a week, she did night shifts. The state intruded into every aspect of their lives. She had to undergo a monthly gynecological check to see she wasn't using contraceptives and hadn't had an abortion. It was her duty to bear 5 children for Romania. To complain about any of this could put her in real danger.
I was afraid of everyone I didn't know. I was afraid at every step, as you didn't know who you were talking to. If you said something, they picked you up. They imprisoned you, or they executed you. Who knows what they could do to you?
Ceausescu found Romania brick, and he's left it imitation marble. The boulevard of the victory of socialism is his indelible, unwanted memorial. This and the damage he did to the life of every single Romanian. The flats in these buildings were intended for his secret police, the people who were supposed to keep him informed about everything. And yet they told him so little about conditions in the country that he believed till his dying moment that the mass of the people loved him. The secret police, the Securitate, controlled everything and everyone. They were due to move into their new quarters here in 2 months' time. But the revolution dismantled their old quarters a little ahead of schedule. In these flats, in the center of the city, the top figures of the Securitate lived. The ransacking of the buildings yielded a number of documents which have been made available to us. They show how the Securitate spied even on their own men. This is the file marked top secret of an undercover Securitate officer, Virgil Vasiloiu. It describes him as arrogant and difficult. There's a plan of his apartment so his colleagues can plant microphones in it. They bugged and transcribed not just his phone calls, but those of his friends and relatives. We went round to the expensive block where Mr. Vasiloiu lived his not-so-private life. His cover was that of an economist at a government institute. No one was in. According to the neighbors, no one had been in since January the 1st. With Ceausescu gone, the Vasiloius had vanished. The neighbors weren't surprised to know that Virgil Vasiloiu was a Securitate man.
He used his car so much that he obviously had dollars to buy extra petrol on the black market. That led us to believe that he worked for a foreign trade company. Because if he didn't travel abroad, how would he have got the dollars to buy the petrol? I don't suppose he knew for certain that he was being spied on, but he probably thought so. A person in his position normally was. It was commonplace in our country for everything you did to be known.
With the Securitate behind him, Ceausescu felt he didn't need any other backing. In Brașov, Romania's second city, we found clear evidence of how he used the Securitate to the detriment of the army. He never trusted the army, worried that it might one day stage a coup against him. He placed it under the effective control of the Securitate. He cut the army's pay and made sure it stayed weak.
The soldiers had not been trained to the same level as the Securitate troops. We didn't have handguns and machine guns like their forces, as was seen during the revolution. These terrorist gangs, the Securitate, had been supplied with better weapons than we had been given.
The skilled workers of the country had no reason to love Ceausescu either. At the important truck-building plant at Brașov, the complaints echo in a curious way those of the army. They too were badly treated and abysmally supplied. The last big uprising against Ceausescu began here in 1987. But the time wasn't ripe then. The strikers later suffered.
Most of them have been moved from Brașov to other towns, which are very far of Brașov. Some of them have been put in prison for 1 year or 2 years, and they have been declared being terrorists.
The crazy destructiveness of the Ceausescu system damaged the Brașov plant badly. They had to make engines from cast iron, not aluminium. When that failed, they were ordered to make carts for horses. The contrast between all this and Ceausescu's grandiose vision was total. He went on building his palace, oblivious to the fact that he was alienating every power block in the state. But the revolution, when it came upon him, was made by individuals as much as by power blocks. We've been following the story of 3 of them. The first is a law professor, who's now the country's vice president. Dumitru Mazilu was once a crony of Ceausescu's, but finally decided he had to bring the human rights abuses here to the attention of the United Nations, no matter what Ceausescu might do to him.
I have informed him that I have no choice. I prefer to be killed, but I have a duty to tell the truth to the world.
The second is a poet, Mircea Dănescu, voluble, witty, slightly wayward. Now he's head of the Writers' Union, but under Ceausescu he attacked the regime and suffered the penalty.
I was arrested in March after the publication of an interview I gave to the French newspaper Libération, in which I criticized Ceausescu's policies. I was held under house arrest, guarded by 18 Securitate men in 3 shifts, 6 men each. Therefore, there were 10 whole months during which I was unable to see my friends or be visited by anyone.
The third is Adrian Donia, young and quick-minded. He's a taxi driver by profession. The problems of earning a decent living under the Ceausescu regime took him further and further towards revolution.
Me personally, I was working 12, 14 hours a day, every day, day by day, including Sunday, including Christmas Eve, including Christmas, and everything like that. So, working in Romania was almost non-stop.
Neither Adrian Donea nor the other 2 men had any idea that the revolution they wanted would come so soon. It was sparked off, of course, by the rioting in Timișoara in mid-December. But the explosion which followed all over the country was so great that it now seems as though a revolution was simply waiting to happen. And yet the outside world has a distorted idea of the explosion which did take place. No Western journalists were in Bucharest when the actual moment of revolution came, the takeover of the Central Committee building here. The journalists arrived only when the counter-revolution was underway. The television pictures of the fierce fighting have given the impression that the whole process was violent. But the revolution itself, as the pictures obtained by Panorama show, was a remarkably peaceful affair. It was Ceausescu's own decision that brought him down. He insisted that ordinary workers be brought in for him to address. The sycophants told him that working-class people loved him. His great mistake was to believe it. In the anonymity of the crowd, people like Adrian Donea were summoning up the courage to do the unthinkable. They started to barrack him. These are the live pictures from state television. Behind, his bodyguard warns him wrongly that the crowd's getting in. Off camera, Mrs. Ceausescu says, "Stay quiet, please." Television transmission is cut.
Everybody was booing and yelling and screaming like that with his face covered because they used to film the crew, the people on the market. So he was stopping and he looked very surprised, and at that moment we had the sensation and the feeling, and we exactly knew that maybe we win. We see they're scared, and in that moment we know that we can do something and we are really a force.
Television coverage was quickly restarted, but the damage had been done. As Ceausescu droned on, our pictures, shot by a film student from his flat, show that people were walking out on their president, something they'd never done before. The man who shot these pictures is Paul Gozigian. The results of his camera work over the following 24 hours throw new light on the way the revolution unfolded and how the different forces happened to come together to win it. At first, the people who had come away from the Ceausescu rally milled about without really knowing what to do now they'd made their gesture of independence. They chanted, "We want free elections." The uniformed Securitate men didn't know what to do either. An hour later, the crowd had swollen. Having seen on television that Ceausescu's power was being challenged, people hurried out to join in. The big question was, how would the Securitate troops react? The answer came at nightfall. Ceausescu and his advisors could think of nothing better than the tactics which had failed at Timișoara. Dozens died, but the crowds protected themselves with vehicles which they used as burning barricades against the onslaught of the Securitate troops. No one really thought the people could win under these terrifying conditions.
I kept on filming because I was thinking that if this would be the single night of our revolution, so I had the world to inform about it and let the world know about the courage of people we have. But so I wasn't sure that Ceausescu could fall next day or next month. So even so, the people must know about what's happening here.
By morning on Friday the 22nd of December, the day of the revolution, our pictures show the crowds still in possession of the streets. The Securitate troops had failed to break their spirit, and by standing their ground, they were winning the battle. The Securitate melted away. What was in question now was what the army would do. The troops sat and watched, under orders not to join in the attack on the unarmed crowds. Then came the decisive moment. At 11 that morning, Romanian television, still loyal to Ceausescu at this stage, broadcast a statement. The defense minister, General Milia, an army man, was a traitor and had committed suicide. In fact, Ceausescu's bodyguard had shot him for failing to back the Securitate troops. Even now, the army didn't move. But the crowd sensed it was a turning point. They attacked the Central Committee building. The most adventurous spirits took the place over. It was the moment of revolution.
I was forcing the main entrance with some other guys, and we take the weapons for several people. They just pull their hands up. So they say, okay, we can't shoot the people, so if you need some guns, they leave the guns down and run upstairs. So these were the first weapons. We take them and we try to go upstairs to see who's inside and who's firing. So a large part of us who had some weapons just run to the first floor.
Ceausescu was still inside when the crowds rampaged through the building. He was trying to reach the roof, but because too many people piled into the lift with him, the lift got stuck. By the time he scrambled into the waiting helicopter, some of the revolutionaries were already swarming onto the roof. While the crowd jeered, the overloaded helicopter lifted off, with the co-pilot perched on Ceausescu's knee. A bodyguard held a gun to the pilot's head as they flew north. Down below, the crowd celebrated with a victory song, adapted from a football supporters' chant. Where's Ceausescu? There's no more Ceausescu. With the great dictator gone, the television station fell to the revolutionaries, again without violence. The poet Mircea Dinescu appeared on the screen. A nation starved of free speech was suddenly deluged with it.
On the 22nd of December at lunchtime, a neighbour came and told me the Securitate guards had run away from my front gate. I came out into the street and looked around. For the first time, the road was clear of Securitate. A friend came to me with his arms raised, saying that Ceausescu had fled. I came out onto the boulevard, where I saw hundreds of thousands of people, led by two armoured personnel carriers. Someone then recognized me and stopped me. He shouted, "It's Mircea Dinescu. He's alive." They lifted me up, they put a flag in my hands, and stuck me on the leading APC to set off to the television station.
Some of the leaders of the crowd asked to talk to the management of the TV to open the station. The station was closed at that time. We opened only at 7 o'clock in the afternoon. And they wanted to talk to the management. The station was opened, and the first message was sent to the public that the dictator is gone and that the people is in control.
If the ever-faithful television service had changed sides, people knew that liberty really had arrived. The entire city erupted with joy. Everyone was a revolutionary now. The communist insignia was cut out of every flag. Still, seizing power wasn't the same thing as exercising it. The ordinary people, without any help, had made the revolution. But the unlikely collection of enthusiasts who'd taken over Ceausescu's office had to decide what to do next. There were sculptors, factory workers, portrait painters, and at least one cinema stuntman among them. No one knew anything about politics.
Trebuie organizat acest loc unde ne aflăm cu toții și trei, trebuie să vedem în concordanță cu cei de la televiziune ce program au ei, ce program au noi și să ieșim, să intrăm într-o coeziune. Și dacă nu există coeziune, în momentul de față, ăia de afară ne vor strivi pe noi ăștia din
At which point the army arrived. They'd done nothing to help, but revolutionary crowds have a tendency to be both naive and generous. The officers were welcomed with open arms.
I first found out that the army had gone over to the side of the people from the television, and also when our commanders ordered us to go into action. We were the first soldiers, the very first soldiers, to take up positions here at the Central Committee. I was greatly moved, very moved by the people embracing us and chanting, "The army is with us. You are our sons, our brothers, and you must help us."
For the army commanders, the first imperative was to restore order. They didn't want to see the country in the hands of people they instinctively distrusted. They called for everyone to hand in their weapons. Having waited to see which way power would go, the generals were now staging a takeover bid. Unaware of what was really happening, the crowd chanted, "The army is with us." It was more the other way round. The Ceausescus, meanwhile, had flown to their lakeside retreat at Snagov. Their staff there hadn't seen them for 2 years.
The helicopter flew in from over there. It landed here, right here. The Ceausescus, both Nicolae and Elena, headed for the villa over there. In the helicopter were Bobu, one of the Politburo members, Manescu, Ceausescu's brother-in-law, and 2 bodyguards.
Bobu and Manescu headed off, the bodyguards stayed. Ceausescus themselves made their way towards the house. The plan was to pick up some valuables and do a little phoning. The villa at Snagov was furnished in the Ceausescu's usual style, expensive but not particularly tasteful. By Romanian standards, it was immensely luxurious. By the standards of Imelda Marcos, it's scarcely rated. Ceausescu made 2 calls, one to a military air base from where they could fly to another country, the other to a party secretary in the mountains. They left Snagov and headed for the airbase at Titu. But Ceausescu suddenly had doubts about the loyalty of the base there. He made the pilot land 5 miles short of it. A local doctor was driving past. The bodyguards flagged him down, and the 4 headed off with him in his battered old car.
Ceausescu turned to me and said, "We're going to organize a resistance. Are you coming with us?" A shocking question, which rather threw me. I tried to put a few words together. I am old. I am ill. I have children. And then I said, "I am not a party member." And that, I think, was a big mistake, because then Ceausescu became red with anger.
Near Târgoviște, the doctor's car broke down. One of the bodyguards slipped away. Then there were 3. They took over another car.
I turned on the radio quite loud. The poet Mircea Dinescu was speaking on it. I recognized his voice because I had seen him on the TV, and I know his way of speaking, very loud.
Ceausescu, hearing what he said, slumped forward onto the dashboard.
He stayed there for a few seconds, and then suddenly he said, "Turn it off."
As they came to Târgoviște, Ceausescu said, "I built them all these factories and they still don't want me." Elena was tougher. She put a gun to the driver's head. He stopped at an agricultural institute. They'd already lost the other bodyguard. Now there were just the 2 of them. The deputy director locked them in.
He was looking at his watch all the time, then up at the sky. Like that. His watch, then the sky.
There was speculation he had a radio beacon in his watch so he could be located.
He was definitely waiting for someone to rescue him.
News of their capture came through to the Central Committee by telex. The honor of announcing it to the crowd fell to Adrian Donea, the taxi driver turned revolutionary.
In the moment I was announcing that from that balcony, everybody was terribly happy because we feel that's it. I mean, we just win. It was important because he starts the tyranny, and the tyranny was stopped with his capture. I mean, the symbolism was very important.
The army had already joined the revolution. Now that it was entirely safe to do so, the politicians climbed on the bandwagon. Most were established communists who'd done their share of kowtowing to Ceausescu in the past. But not all were time servers. Dumitru Mazilu suddenly appeared, just released from prison, and was duly proclaimed vice president. He had the country's draft constitution already prepared in his inside pocket.
In prison, I have prepared our program of revolution. And our program is officially now. All these 10 points of our program were accepted by my colleagues, by the people in the place of revolution. I read this text before the people in the place of revolution, and people applaud and told, okay, this is our program, agree.
But it had all been too good and too peaceful to last. The Securitate had just been regrouping. Now they staged their attempted counter-revolution. The plan was to create such instability that Ceausescu could be rescued and reinstated. And they wanted revenge. Hundreds died that Friday night, among them Marin Neagu, the abattoir worker, who'd joined the demonstrations because he couldn't stand the poverty he and his family were suffering. By Christmas morning, the counter-revolution was over. The cost was high. The university library destroyed, thousands homeless. Perhaps the Bolshevik revolution in Russia in 1917 looked something like this. But this was a revolution that no one had planned and that had no clear ideology. To consolidate and protect it, the new group of leaders agreed they had to give the Ceausescus a summary trial and then shoot them.
We have to decide what to do to prepare a very long debate, a very long trial, ordinary trial, or to organize a military trial, an extraordinary trial, and to finish with this tyranny in Romania.
The trial was to take place at the army barracks at Târgoviște. It was a combination of show trial and drumhead court-martial in which the defendants were harangued and duly sentenced. They had bled the country dry for 24 years. Now the country demanded their blood. Nothing less would satisfy the millions whose lives Ceausescu had damaged. In the atmosphere of near hysteria in the country, though, Ceausescu's execution and the hunting down of the Securitate men had a curiously beneficial effect. It was as if they alone were responsible for everything bad. The burden of guilt was somehow lifted from all those who had said nothing, who had outwardly conformed. Now it was all the fault of the Securitate, not the army, not the 3 million party members, certainly not the ordinary people. There were plenty of Securitate men around still, even in the Central Committee building. We watched as a witch hunt progressed inside Ceausescu's old office. The revolutionaries were accusing each other now of working for the Securitate. It was ugly and frightening, but it wasn't to last. It was, in a way, a form of exorcism. Here, a lieutenant colonel in the Securitate has been captured. He insists he was just an ordinary guard, that he handed in his weapons, and that anyway he had orders not to shoot anyone. They don't believe it. And when they search his flat, it's clear he was someone important. His fridge is extremely well stocked for Romania. He has an expensive video recorder and plenty of tapes. Finally, they discover his identity cards. The pretense is over.
Ce aveți în subordine? N-am avut nimic în subordine, sunt lucrător, fără să aveți nimic. Fără să conduc ceva, da. Când ați primit ordinul? Să nu tragem? Să nu trageți. În toată ziua. Vineri. Vineri la 8. Vineri la ora 8 și după aceea s-a repetat tot mereu să nu tragem, să nu tragem.
We don't know what happened to him, but almost certainly he was executed. Just about every Securitate man captured at that time was. At first, anyone caught inside a Securitate building like this one was liable to be summarily shot. But in the past few days, the mood has changed. The killing seems to be over. Partly, it's because the army has taken control of the Securitate, and the army is managed by skillful footwork to ensure that it's trusted and respected in the country. But there seems anyway to be a surprising willingness to forget the past, in spite of the bloodshed here and in other parts of the country during the revolution. Brajov, for instance, is slowly coming alive after the years of repression. The city's loudspeakers are playing music by Gheorghe Zamfir that's been banned for years. The instinctive fear of authority is lessening. But Brajov suffered in the immediate aftermath of revolution like everywhere else.
So, this is where you have the skin graft. Yes. And
here, a British medical team has been helping to treat the serious wounds caused by the bullets which the Securitate used.
Okay. They produced the most horrific injuries. For example, penetrating the thigh, I've seen injuries where perhaps 5 or 6 inches of the femur, the main bone of the thigh, was shattered beyond belief by one of the explosions these things produce. And of course, then you have bits of metal left all over the place inside the leg as a result of it all.
You can find some more pillows.
As the revolution starts to fade, though, it's being seen more in proportion.
Okay, thank you.
The interim government no longer claims there were 60,000 deaths. Quietly, it's accepted a far lower figure. Moderation is in the air.
I don't want revenge against anybody, because it's enough. I want to live in a normal life from now on, without revenge.
Revenge, though, was very much Ceausescu's line. After the uprising here 2 years ago, he cut the food rations for the people of Brajov.
Ceausescu sent all the food to the others. That's why we had no food. And now we hope to have food.
The organization which is providing it is the army. In some ways, the army is actually running Brajov now. It led the revolution here, and it's positioning itself to take care of everything, under the guidance of its commander, General Florea. He's a member of the interim government, the National Salvation Front. His men do the problem solving. The army are now the top dogs in Brajov instead of the Securitate, and they make sure they get the credit for fixing things. And so does General Florea, of course.
The people here have put their trust in the army and General Florea. That was because he took command of all the forces in Brasov in order to stop the bloodbath, the massacre. He was the one person with the authority to speak to both the commander of the Securitate and the military.
Authority is exactly what Romania's government lacks. The National Salvation Front is half unwieldy cabinet, half debating chamber. All three revolutionary forces are here. The soldiers, like General Florea from Brajov, the last remnants of the original revolutionaries, with Mircea Dinescu forever on his feet, declaiming, and the ex-communist politicos, who now say they're as democratic as anyone. But they all get bogged down in the most trivial topics, even the naming of streets.
There's a proposal from the young revolutionaries to adopt a law renaming that famous, or rather odious, boulevard of the victory of so-called socialism to the boulevard of the 22nd of December. Do you agree?
Excuse me, I'm not sure if that particular street, which looks rather unpleasant anyway, should be named after the 22nd of December.
Well, that's the proposal.
No. The date should certainly be commemorated, but not with that boulevard.
There's a naive belief here that men of goodwill can stick together indefinitely, even if they've got nothing in common.
We have in mind the possibility of a very general cooperation between these parties. We could cooperate with everyone, because everyone has had the same enemy, the tyranny in Romania.
The question is, will the National Salvation Front turn itself into a party? I think it shouldn't be transformed, and I wouldn't want to be a part of it. It's just an accident that we all came together. Over time, our different political attitudes will be clearly defined. Because I personally disagree with a lot of things that are being decided by the front.
Some parties are gradually forming, their eyes on the elections planned for the spring. The Democratic Peasants' Party, for instance, deeply conservative and religious. It held a demonstration yesterday, something the National Salvation Front was instinctively opposed to. It's like a crash course in democracy here for everyone. Still, the lack of party political feeling has some advantages. Even at the television station, the most slavish institution of the Ceausescu state, there's been no political purge. The same man reads the news with exactly the gravitas he used 3 weeks ago to heap praise on Ceausescu. Only the studio set has changed.
Any one of us working here has to rethink the whole life, professionally, personally. Everything is changed. It's a very big gift which you can't take in all at once. It has to be done gradually.
For the taxi driver, who's now a government advisor, the new age is about to bring something more personal, the birth of their first child. But though Ceausescu's brave new world is gone, its dreadful legacy remains, the longing to be told what to do.
All the problems became to be real problems. I mean, all we have to do is to change, to try to change the old mentality, because people are disorganized. They just wait for some orders coming from somewhere. It won't be any orders coming from somewhere. They have to organize themselves and to think free and to think democratic.
Today in Bucharest, they were hard at work repairing the self-inflicted wounds of the revolution. The process shouldn't take long. But after the years of total subservience to one man, Romanians are left with no tradition of democracy and no experience of coping on their own. That, in its way, is Nicolae Ceausescu's vengeance on the people who overthrew him.
Să o mai creadă nimeni în viață așa ceva și cum a putut să facă. Adică, bineînțeles că noi am făcut-o, noi, poporul, că n-a făcut-o el, că de unul singur n-a făcut-o, e adevărat că n-a făcut-o el de unul singur, noi am făcut oamenii, că el n-a avut cum, da. Ne-a băgat pe noi la ruină și ne-a terminat.
Noi am murit de foame și
nu e rost și
și-a aranjat vila ca să poată să stea, să nu fie deranjat. Noi munceam până ne treceau sudorile, n-aveam mâncare, mergeam acasă, apa curgea pe noi. Sunt oameni care stau câte 5 copii într-o locuință, într-o garsonieră de confort 3-4. Acolo gătește, acolo se spală, acolo mănâncă, o singură cameră. Toaleta este o iubetă. De ce, doamnă? Ca să știe în ce condiții a lăsat Ceaușescu oamenii să stea. Mureau copiii în spitale de foame și din cauza bolilor.
Să ne fie rușine de gesturi. Ăștia sunt adevărurile.
Să facă alee cu pântâni arteziene și cu lumini.
Și toată lumea, acum trebuie să ne fie rușine, să ne fie frică. Nu trebuie să ne fie frică. Ăsta este adevărul. Noi am muncit și alții au beneficiat. Exact ca și dumneavoastră care stați scole așa și doar ne păziți pe noi și luați un salariu și noi muncim până în...
Acesta este mijlocul Casei Republicii, exact sala din centrul casei. Și observați că este făcută absolut simetric. 3 uși acolo, 3 uși aici, 4 coloane, 4 coloane, 4 ferestre, 4 ferestre și 2 încadramente de oglinzi pe acest perete și 2 pe peretele celălalt. Și tot în această sală observați că toată butaforia tavanului se reflectă absolut identic pe podea.
Ez a köztársaságház, ez Bukarestbe épült, ez a Fehérház, ahogy mondják. Mondják így a nép, ahogy mondta. A főnökháza, igen. Hát összesen körülbelül voltak 15-20 ezer ember körülbelül, aki oda dolgozott. És katonák, ilyen kis katonák, akik mind úgy dolgoztak, mint napszámosok, meg melyiknek volt mesterségük, például hegesztők, lakatosok, dolgoztak. És betettek ilyen hálókba, a 80 ember lakott egy ilyen hálóba, ilyen emeletes vaságyak voltak, és körülbelül 80-an voltunk ottan. Egy ilyen barakba voltunk 4 dormitor. 4x8, az 320 ember volt egy barakba. Hát azt lehet mondani, hogyha az ember logikusan gondolkozik, úgy lehetett venni, hogy láger. Láger. Na. Ja, mikor meghalt? Hát én azt mondtam neki, mikor láttam, hogy le van esve a földre, le volt feküve. Én úgy láttam, hogy ő kacagba halt meg. És mondom a feleségemnek, te látod, ez az utolsó pillanatban is kacagott minket, de azért kacagott, mert azt gondolta magába, hogy meghaltam, de várjatok, majd mi fog történni utána. Azt kacagta. Hogy mi fog történni majd utána. Hát én nem tudom, hogy mi fog történni, de minden esetre lehet, hogy kacaghatta, mi történik.
Nagypénteken, testvéreim, emlékezzünk, hogy azt mondotta az Úr Jézus, amit megcselekedtetek az emberekkel, velem cselekedtétek meg. Nézd meg jól a kezedet, testvérem. Ez a kéz bántotta az Úr Jézust. Hiába mossuk a kezünket Pilátusként, ez a kéz véres az Úr Jézus vérétől. És el kellett hordozni a büntetést és a halált, és megszületik egy új én, amelyik már másképpen tud élni és cselekedni úgy, hogy ez a cselekedet Istennek legyen dicsőség, és az embernek áldás. Amen. Az ő orcáját te rajtad. Az Úr könyörüljön rajtad. Az Úr adjon békességet néked. Ne félj, mert én veled vagyok. Ne félj, mert én megsegítlek. E pohár az új szövetség az én vérem által. Ezt cselekedjétek az én emlékezetemre. Az Úrnak halálát érgessétek. Boldogok a békességre igyekezők.
Spațiul este mai restrâns. Să vină și doamna Pintigan. Poftiți!
Domnul director general, prima dată cereți scuze, noi nu am chemat pe nici și nici n-am știut că vin după noi. Au venit în Viștea și noi am fost plecat. Atâta ședință am făcut, ședință peste ședință, și avem cerere împreună cu Nedeșelul, retragere din asociație. Noi vrem să retragem și noi vrem să lucrăm pentru noi și pentru stat. Am gătat cu terorismul și nu mai trebuie să comande Zori. Noi nu suntem în contra de asociație, noi suntem pentru binele nostru, pentru tuturora. Așa că vă rugăm frumos, mod ominesc, să ne înțelegeți. Noi vrem să retragem vacile, avem grajdul colectivului, unde am ținut vacii și noi vrem să muncim mai departe. Zoli nu a ajutat cu nimic și țineți cont că milioane de lei au pierdut. E rușine pentru noi, ca viștenii, suntem oameni gospodari, muncitori, să ne stăm așa mai departe. Pământul așteaptă pe noi, noi așteptăm pământul. 3 rând de vaci, 3.000 de vaci sau 5.000 de vaci au distrus, au murit. Nici statul n-a avut de mâncat, nici oamenii. Am cosit și am lucrat. Ca să puteți să vedeți acolo, să filmează că în ce har stă vacile.
Da.
Și sunt pe pererea oamenilor și întrebați pe toți, dacă chiar vreți.
Am înțeles că dumneata ai expus aici părerea tuturor, da?
Tot satul.
Da. Deci asta este părerea dumneavoastră. Da. Cred că e bine să ascultăm și directorul de asociație, care este părerea dumnealui și eventual să veniți și cu propuneri în legătură cu modul de rezolvare. Poftiți, domnule director.
Noi am discutat cu oamenii de la început și a fost și o înțelegere între noi că terenul... Stați un pic ca să terminăm. Am ascultat și eu de dumneavoastră. Noi am avut câteva ședințe care am ținut împreună. În această perioadă, dânsii, la urmă, s-au înțeles că nu mai vor să rămână în asociație. Noi am ținut ședință cu dânsii în care ei au manifestat dorință că vor să iasă din asociație cu cota parte 35% cu câte au intrat în asociație și înseamnă că preiau asupra lor și ce trebuie dat înapoi pentru investiții, adică datoriile față de stat. Dar se pune întrebarea, acum, dacă dânsii vor ieși, ce se întâmplă cu 500 de animale, aproape 600 de animale care rămân pe stoc la ora actuală? Noi avem furaje încă pentru o lună de zile, că putem întreține. Adică, ori dacă există o colaborare, adică ar exista o colaborare și o înțelegere cu dânsii, cu CAP-ul, Viștea, dacă vor CAP-ul, ca să producă ei furajele, să ne vindă nouă sau să găsim o soluție de rezolvat. Fiindcă nu putem bate joc de aceste animale care sunt în unitate și nici de câteva milioane de lei de investiții care există la ora actuală.
Domnul director general, domnul director nu vorbește adevărat. Nu. Noi nu vrem, Sumordocu, Sempalu, vrei să iei vacile, în cota bani. Și vă rog frumos, aia 140 de vaci, ce o dus de la Gheorghe, să face, la Georgien, să face ce vrei cu disul. Pentru ce o dus? Pentru ce o dus. Să face ce vrei cu noi, în pășunea noastră, în mod categoric, spunem, nu lăsăm. Și asta e o vorbe absurde, ca să menține postul acolo. Nu vrem nici să-l vedem acolo, domnul director general. Dacă nu o mutați de acolo, pe domnul director, se întâmplă ce nu trebuie să întâmple.
Ezt nagy pénteken szoktuk felvenni, mikor gyászosba veszünk úrvacsorát. A blues jön hamarabb, utána jön a szoknya.
Hogy szokták összefogni a szoknyát?
A szoknyát azt ott papírba mi ide szoktuk tenni az asztalra a papírt, Erikával meg összefogjuk. Így. Igen. Így szoktuk. És a kötényt is, amelyik a kötény két kötéses, nem pántlikás ruha, azt ide szoktuk, a pántlikás ruhákat meg össze szoktuk fogni, meg varni. Így, meg ezzel a kötővel meg szoktam kötni. Kopcsak. Ez így van összefogva.
Mindig ilyen gondosan összeszokták?
Igen, mindig. Mert nem szeretem, hogyha nincsen összefogva, mert kimegy belőle a guglér, és meg akkor nem áll jól a szoknya. Úgy olyan...
Hát akkor mennyibe kerül egy lányt felruházni?
Jaj, hát azt nem lehet kiszámítani. Sokba.
Értem.
Édesanyám nem idevalósi volt, úgyhogy elég sok ruhát rendezett nekem, hogy nekem is úgy legyen, és én is úgy érezzem magamat, mint a többik.
Értem.
Hogy legyen.
És hogyha olyan sokba kerülnek ezek a ruhák, hogy győzik az emberek?
Hát dolgozunk. Dolgozunk, meg várunk. Ezt csinálni kell. Itt nálunk Kalotaszegen ezt kell csináljuk. hogyha akarjuk, hogy a lányoknak is, meg nekünk is úgy legyen, mint a többiknek.
Elvek, mondd meg miért. Gyere vissza meg oda. Hallod, gyere erre, mikor azt mondtam én neked. Nem hallod? Hogy igaz, akkor mindig mind a farikon.
És ha már feloszlanak a komplexumot, mi lesz magukra?
Elég baj lesz, ha felbontják. Sok ember innét élt. Sokan, télen, nyáron. Télen, nyáron, sokan. Nem vállal, Gerőc Jancsi azt mondta, hogy nem kell egy fejős se, és aztán gondozónak se.
Mikor mondtam te?
Mindegyik fejő azt mondta, s ezek a gondozók.
Na mondja, melyik mondta?
Na mindegyik azt mondta már. Kati, te is mondtad, ez is mondta, és a másik is mondta. Mindegyik mondta.
Mondd meg, kinek mondtad, hogy... De hát mondd meg, kinek mondta, mondja. Kinek mondtam? Ha mondtam neked?
Nekem nem, de én is
No,
hallottam.
Ilusnél mondtam neked, hogy nem kell?
Ő is hallott.
Mondtam?
Én nem.
Kati, mondtam neked? Kománi, mondtam? Neked, hogy hazudtok ti ilyesmit, hogy én nem azt mondtam? Hát mondd meg, melyik itt vagytok né. Mondtam valamelyiknek?
Valamelyiknek csak kellett. Igen, nem mondtad akkor.
Igen, el kell, hát elindította vagy Kati, nem mondtam magának, hogy nem kell feljönnek maga.
28 esztendő, nem 28 napú.
Más úgyse kaptuk, más gondozókat, csak minket, mert nem jön senki.
Hogy a komplexnek dug.
A komplex?
Senki.
A kollektívnek, és a komplexnek.
Hát akkor még ezután is ha akar dolgozni.
Nézd. Innen Csamásig ment oda. Már egy kerüljött.
Nem volt gondozó, csak a kollektívnél is azok voltak a gondozók, akik most gondozók. Ezután is az lesz gondozó.
A kollektívnek, mert nem menjen senki, csak mi.
Ha nem menjen, akkor elgondozza, akinek kell a tehén.
Hát pontosan.
Vannak, akik beadtak sok hektárokat a kollektívába.
Összeszidnak, oda szólunk, meg összeszidnak is, hogy ugye
Hát,
a
hogyha
nagyobbak,
akarnunk,
hogy
maradjon
a kollektív. Van, aki akarja, hogy ne maradjon. Van olyan ember, hogy kellene neki marha, állat, hogy osszák ki. Én a föld az embereknek. Ami volt, régen adtak be földet, mert van olyan ember, hogy rég adott be földet, s az akarja visszakapni azt a földet, ami az övé volt. Ez a nagy baj, és akkor nem is mérünk szólni, mert mi nem adtunk be földet, nekünk nem volt, akkor hát csak szólhatunk, nem hogy egyáltalán, csak nincs olyan nagy szavunk, mint azoknak, akiknek van földjük, volt beadva, marhas földet adtak be, mindent. Azoknak jobb, nagyobb a szavuk, másabb a...
Néha, amikor bemegy templomba, kicsit szégyeli magát?
Hát a szegény szégyelli magát, mert nem is akarnak még helyet se adni a templomba. Van olyan, hogy úgy tartsa másiknak, hogy ez barátnőm, ide nehogy leülj.
Aztán azt nézik meg, hogy milyen szép a gúnyája, hogy milyen gúnyával menjen a templomba, hogy annak van olyan, mint neki. S ha nincsen, akkor lekacagják.
Csúfolódnak, s kacagnak.
Nem is mér az ember
nem is
menni
mérünk
még a
menni templomba. Ezért a dologért.
keretbe.
Hát mit csináljuk? A sajnálán lukru.
Itt nincs folyóvíz?
Folyóvíz nincs. Nincs.
Hát van gyirokon?
Van a Temes.
Temes?
A Temes.
Az messze, az 14 kilométer innen.
Nincs bevezetve a víz?
Ja, itt nincs bevezetve. Nincs. Azért van ez a pompa.
Nincs. Itt van a kút. Itt van a kút.
Ez itt a labda. Ez a kút.
40 méter mély.
És ilyesmiben az állam nem segített?
Semmit, abszolút. Mindenki saját maga.
Miért nem segített?
Ez partikulár. Az állam
ingyen?
fordítvaság is sokszor. Nem úgy.
Nem segített.
Most már máma, vagy hogy lesz, nem tudjuk, de eddig így volt.
És maguk, hogy mondják maguk és újabban fenyegették azzal, hogy levontják a házat?
Igen. Sőt, azért állunk így ilyen menőleg, hogy úgy volt, hogy bezébe lebontottak volna. Ha forradalom ne legyen, akkor most lebontottak volna most a tavasz. Igen, azért állunk így nem csinálunk semmit, nem reparáltunk semmit.
Nincs a miért. Ő sem.
Fel voltunk szólítva, hogy
maradt egy darabig.
le leszünk bontva.
Úgy akartak csinálni szentgyillatort. Ott, ahol mi vagyunk.
Akartak blokkot csinálni.
Úgy volt az, hogy lebontanak, de végül voltam a szisztématizálnál. És azt mondta, hogy lehet, hogy ottan fogunk maradni végleg. Tehát most megváltozott a kocka. Most már nem úgy.
Hát
most már marad. Egy darab.
Egyelőre nem bontnak.
Tessék?
Kinek volt jó a kommunizmus?
Ugye kinek volt jó? Szekuristáknak, és a pártembernek, és a milicisták, azok jól ettek, ittak, minden volt nekik.
És kaptak nagy fizetést.
Nagy fizetés.
15 000 lej, 10 000 lej, 8, legkisebbnek 5 000 lej. Hát mi nem kapunk, nem dolgozott.
Nem dolgoztak azok. Pláne a szekuristák, az csak
És
vertük
hogyha
az embereket.
ha az ember valahol állt a többségben, akkor figyelte, hogy mit mond. És akkor látta, hogy mi a helyzet, gyere ide. És akkor megfogtas, be a kocsiba. Bevitték, jól megverték. Úgyhogy vagy sem áll.
Hát sokan a forradalomán nem lőtték le, élve megfogták, és lehúzták a körmüket. Lehúzták. Igen. Élve a szekuristák. Lehúzták a körmüket.
Akkor összekötözték vizébe drótokkal, és élve letemették a temetőbe. Kiszedték a földből.
Ide, közbékéteni. Én voltam munkában. Mikor végeztünk a munkából korábban, jöttem haza. Látom, hogy sok nép van ottan. Mi van ottan? Szörnyűség. Be voltak csavarba egyik részben 25 ember, a másik felében 25. Nylonnét át volt kötve és sórén. A legfelsőnek ez össze volt kötve. Dróttal. És úgy vették ki. Akkor le voltak forrázva. És úgy szedték, hogy akkor vettek gyógycsot, becsomagolták, és akkor vitték, egyet elvittek az opera elejébe, hogy a nép lássa. És aztán akkor kezdték ezeket a szekurisokat keresni. Ők csinálták éjjel, hogy kevesebb legyen a nép. Ez kontra.
És miért védték annyira durván azt a régi rendszert?
Kegyetlenek voltak, rossz lelkűség.
timpul Revoluției, să știți că eu n-am pierdut pe nimeni. Probabil că tot Dumnezeu a fost cel care a păzit băiatul meu și a venit acasă nevătămat. Dumnezeu l-a păzit, așa să știți.
Așa mi-a păzit și pe al meu fiu Dumnezeu.
Dar vă spun din toată inima că toți cei care au murit sunt rupți din sufletul meu. Și dacă toți ar gândi așa, ar fi nemaipomenit. Sunt rupți din sufletul meu tocmai pentru că acești copii cu piepturile goale au încercat să lupte și să distrugă ce noi n-am fost în stare 45 de ani.
Több idős ember mondta azt, hogy csak mi lettünk volna, mi vagyunk képesek. És érdekes az, hogy mi elindítottuk, és abban a pillanatban mellénk álltak. Szóval nem mondhatom, hogy ez csak az ifjúság forradalom. Az ifjúság indította el. Az ifjúságnak volt bátorsága elindítani, de mellénk álltak. Szóval nem volt olyan ember, aki nézőként nézze ezt az egész eseményeket, amik itt végbe mentek. Szóval itt mindenki részes tagja volt ennek. Mindenki, effektív mindenki részt vett ebbe az egész folyamatban.
Eu nu m-am așteptat, în primul rând, ca Revoluția să fie în Timișoara. Pentru mine Timișoara a fost și este un oraș al liniștii. A fost un oraș care a avut de toate. Deci n-a fost un oraș unde mă așteptam să izbucnească Revoluția.
Je m'excuse de parler français, mais mon anglais est plutôt courageux que bon. Welcome, and it's a great moment for us, and we are very, very glad to see you here. Nous considérons que c'est un peu, votre présence est un peu l'apothéose de notre maison, et vous savez, notre maison est tout ce que nous avons, la sauvegarde de cette maison et la sauvegarde de l'esprit de cette maison. Nous considérons que c'est tout ce que nous ayons réalisé de meilleur dans la vie. Non seulement en ce qui concerne les objets, mais en ce qui concerne l'esprit que ces objets symbolisent. Parce que, vous savez, ici, tout est signe et symbole. Nous considérons que la grande réalisation de notre existence est d'avoir réussi à rester fidèle à une certaine échelle de valeurs qui a ses racines dans notre bonne vieille culture méditerranéenne. Donc, enfin, nous avons réussi à vivre ici ensemble. Vous savez, c'était toujours une grande famille avec plusieurs générations sous le même toit. Mon mari est roumain, moi je suis hongroise. On a parlé à la maison 3 langues, le hongrois, l'allemand et le roumain certainement. Vous savez, chacun de nous a réussi de sauvegarder intacte sa personnalité, de sauvegarder intacte sa langue, sa religion. Nos différences ont été toujours complémentaires et ces différences constituaient un enrichissement réciproque de la vie. Et puisque nous parlons du message des objets, je veux vous présenter cette horloge qui a appartenu à ma grand-mère. Et l'horloge a fait le délice de mon enfance. hélas, notre petite Forsyth saga touche à sa fin, puisque les vieilles dames, les parents et tous ceux qui nous ont accompagnés sont partis, ils sont au cimetière. Hélas, ma sœur et toute sa famille est partie. Et maintenant, nous nous sentons un peu esselés, mais je vis avec l'espoir qu'un beau jour, ils reviendront tous.